You're about to listen to an episode of the Leadership Melting Pot podcast, brought to you by Lumos. Engage with us as we dissect an aspect of leadership and see how you may apply some of what is shared across your business. So hi everyone, my name is Romeo Effs. I'm the CEO and founder of Lumos. Lumos is a management consultancy that works with companies to make them more purposeful and a force for good in the world. Pretty much, how they show up in the world and how they impact the world to make a difference. So I'm happy that you could join us on our inaugural episode of the Lumos Melting Pot. And today we're joined by two phenomenal guests. Both of them are individuals that I've known for a number of years and have worked with in numerous capacities. And I couldn't ask for two better guests to be a part of this inaugural episode, but also to speak to the topic of leadership and the current trends that we're seeing in 2020 and beyond. So I am firstly joined by my dear good friend, Karl Rego. Yay! Karl has been a chairman. He is advisor to numerous boards and numerous companies. He's been an entrepreneur for over 20 years. He has experience leading and changing and delivering growth and impact for purpose-driven Fortune 100 companies and mid-market scale up. He's worked with companies like Barclays, IBM, Coca-Cola, McKinsey's, and now he is a private equity dealer who has originated, funding and deals well over 10 billion US dollars, and is also a committee member for the Harvard Business Angels of London. So if anyone knows a few things about leadership and where it's going, it would definitely be Karl. And I'm also joined by Heather Bewers. Heather and I have also go way back. I think I met Heather about 4 or 5 years ago. Heather is one of the founding members and co-facilitators for KPMG C-Suite Leadership Program. But Heather is also what I would call, and a lot of people would call, a futurologist. I don't know if she would accept that name, but Heather has this unique ability to work with senior leaders to kind of help them to shape what the future looks like, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, and building and seeing where the gaps are in their businesses and building that. She spent 25 years with KPMG, working, in as an accountant and an auditor, in mergers and acquisition, an advisor to numerous companies, and now she runs her own businesses. Change is an Opportunity Limited, where she actually works with FTSE 100 organizations and major public institutions in terms of helping them, to develop and grow and looking to where the future is. So welcome, Heather. Welcome, Karl. Thank you both for taking time out and for your patience in getting this kicked off. Right?
Thanks
Cool.
so much, Romeo. Really appreciate the glowing introduction there. Thanks so much. I did not pay the gentleman for that, but it was quite a nice intro. Thank you. I did send him some Cliff Notes. But thank you.
Thank you, Romeo.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So I think where I'd really like to start with both of you is just kind of looking at, what's your take on what leadership is? And of course, we're talking about leadership in the business context, but, you could take it from, much wider. And also the whole notion of whether or not, people would say leaders are born versus leaders are can be nurtured and developed. So, let's start with that. Heather, let's kick off with you. What's your kind of perspective on what leadership is?
Well, one of my bugbears is language. And we have this obsession, I think, with defining things. And I think leadership is a great instance of where we want it defined. And reality, as with so many things these days, I don't think it's one thing. I think it's a spectrum. And I would distinguish between leadership roles which are defined as you will lead this group of people or this set of activities, and the behaviors and activities of leaders. Now, the two overlap, but I would argue they are not actually synonyms at all. So, for me, a leader can be somebody who just demonstrates a behavior or an activity which people choose to follow. So, role models
Mm-hmm.
are a great instance. There are so many things where people see a role model at work and actually it can have huge influence. You look at women, particularly, if you look at what works best in helping women come through the ranks into more senior places, more often than not, they will talk about role models, even though those may not be leaders per se, but role modeling as a leadership. That's totally different from a CEO, where you have a clearly defined leadership role. But I think what's interesting, and there's a great example in the company Hire, where as we start to work very differently in business, and Hire particularly is a real expert in working through autonomous teams, their CEO and chairman is absolutely convinced we need less management and more leaders. And those leaders are frequently informal. And really, I come back to my definition, which is really simple. Leadership is something that other people follow. And I think it really is as broad as that.
All right, cool. Brilliant. I like that. Different perspectives in terms of leadership. Yes, I can definitely see that. I was never the one to believe that leaders are born. I think, leadership skills can be nurtured and can be learned along the way. Carl, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. So I would echo much of, or probably everything Heather just said. From my perspective, I would say if we talk about leadership, there are leaders and leadership. So from my perspective, it's about inspiration and achievement. So leaders, those are two of the hallmarks.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to be inspiring, and then in a business context, if there's no outcome from that ultimately, then I would argue that the leader probably, if that's all they're brought in to do, great, but they probably haven't fully fulfilled the brief if they're not achieving something as a result of that. Okay. And to your point, I think in terms of nature, nurture, are leaders born or made? I think a bit of both. I do think some individuals can be born with certain characteristics that make them more predisposed towards leadership. However, I think much like Michelangelo had to chip away the bits of marble that were not Michael in his beautiful sculpture. We each of us are going through that process, and some of us have fewer or lesser rough edges to polish up along the way. So, and I could go on and on about leadership and what it's about, what it means to me. Another metaphor I like is that of leader as tour guide rather than travel agent. That comes from
Mm.
John Maxwell, right? So that's about, so in terms of I can go on for a while, but if in practice for me, when I think about leadership, I think of probably three models that kind of overlap. One is the concept of servant leadership, because for me, my whole life, one of my main filters is how can I help? And then so there's servant leadership. Then there's also situational leadership, because there are times when we need to be a little more directive. In times of crisis, we need to be a little bit more directive in saying, here's a directive of travel. If your building's on fire and the police and the fire department roll up, you don't want them to just come up there and start taking a poll to see what they should do. You want them to say, here, go this way, here's what we need to do, right?
Yeah,
Versus in other contexts in business, there's a time to be more consultative and things like that as well.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then I had another point in that regard. It'll come back to me. So, and also just to, in these modern times, leadership requires what I say, kind of a cool head and a warm heart. So I'll pause there. There's a lot more to it than that, but
Yeah.
I don't want to bore you there. I had another example. I'll come back to it.
No, no, no. That's perfect. I remember my very first kind of foray into what leadership really meant was I think I was probably 25, and I just got promoted to being director of operations for an airline in the Caribbean, and I was actually the youngest person, I'm told, to have gotten that role, in an airline, in the aviation industry. And I was working, my CEO was a guy called Paul Moreira, much older than me, and he said to me, when I was struggling, and I thought the whole notion of leadership was just giving instructions and just beating people over the head to make sure that they get things done. He said to me that your role as a leader is to ensure that everyone that reports to you have all the resources and things they need to get the job done, right? He says once you ensure that you provide everything that they need, then you're successful as a leader, right? That's one point. The other point, he says that you need to ensure that when you are not here, your department can run. And so therefore you should train those who report to you how to run the entire department. So if you're not here, it can function, right? And so, that was something that I really took to heart. And, that has been my kind of the foundation for what I see leadership is, right?
I just remember the third part of my response. So I talked about servant leadership, kind of the core for me, situational leadership, where are we on the spectrum, and how do we engage with each individual as an individual, and how do we deal with the circumstance? And then third is transformational leadership, which is ultimately for me, one aspect of leadership is about helping individuals, organizations, and society achieve on their way to achieve more of their full potential. So that self-actualization element for me is really important. And there's the old anecdotal stories about when a good leader makes an appearance and takes some action, does something that people say, oh wow, look at how good it look, they're great. When a great leader comes in, the people leave, and when the leader leaves, they think, wow, I'm great, right?
Mhm.
So there's that bit of whether it's empowerment, capacity building, something about where you are helping people. It's that coach and mentor role as well, where you're actually helping people see more of their own potential than maybe they're able to see based on their background. You're supporting them. You're sometimes maybe taking more of a stand for them than they're able to take for themselves in the moment. And then the final point on this is, from a coaching perspective, one of the roles of a leader in a coaching context is two things. One is to help raise awareness and responsibility within the minds of people they're working with. I'll pause there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely agree. I'd love you to jump in here, Heather. But also, Heather, while you're on the mic, one of the things we spoke about before we started recording is the whole notion of efficiency versus resilience, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about how leaders can get those things mixed up. So, as you come into what Carla said, transition into that as well, because I think that's also really very important.
Well, I think it picks up on what Carl's been saying, but also what you said, Romeo, which is this business about enabling the people who are working in the business. And that's become so much more difficult as we move into a world which is more and more uncertain. And I think one of the most difficult, there are a number of things which have become, I think, increasingly difficult for leaders to do. But one of them is to reconcile where the business has come from and all of the value represented there with a really uncertain future, which may require the business to take a very different direction of travel. So, my example would be BP, which is, we all know, is a fossil fuel business. But if you look at what that business is talking about, what Bernard Lee has been doing is to talk about integrated energy, to bring people on a coherent path from where they've come from where they've gone to. That's really, really hard. It's not, it encompasses purpose, but it's much broader than that. It's about the whole capability of the business and how do you make that comfortable for people to believe that the business has a future as well as them. And that does involve a whole pile of very different things for me for leadership. And one of those is that where a lot of businesses have come from is a massive emphasis on efficiency, particularly cost efficiency. And COVID has really driven that as well. If you haven't got your income coming in, you then have to save costs. The problem is that if you want to be agile in an uncertain world, you do need to have resilience. And resilience
Yeah.
requires levels of redundancy. So you have options. You may have more people than you need. You may have more skills than you need because you don't know at the point at which you're going to need them. And so all of these things are requiring huge change in leaders' personal skill sets, as well as how they show up in the business and the examples they set and the protocols, etc., that they try and establish, simply because
Yeah.
the world of the future is more uncertain.
Yeah. But that just kind of completely, I think, um forces leaders to really rethink, what does this whole notion of leadership is.
Yeah.
Because before, I think, especially those of us who went to business school, we're kind of taught that leadership is this thing that fits in a box, or it has a certain kind of length and shape. And I think what has been happening over the past 2 years in particular is that a lot of leaders, we're finding, are now struggling in terms of, oh no, it's not as monolithic and binary as we've been taught it was. Karl, you were about to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, Lord Glassman, Morris Glassman here in the UK, during COVID, he gives these talks for the Turnaround Management Association, and normally they're in person at the House of Lords. This one was virtual. He likened it. This is the headline is: it's been a shift from just in time to just in case
Yep.
in the halls of policymakers
Yes.
and in boardrooms
Yeah.
for those businesses that are getting the message, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that required, and just what Heather mentioned there, for many years it was you're optimizing for efficiency. And I gave a talk on leadership in times of crisis, and I pulled a nice summary from MIT and Boston Consulting Group about what they're seeing in industry, about what works for organizational resilience. And they talked about, I think, one, I would say the world now needs much more systems thinking, not in a technical systems perspective, but in a sense of interrelated parts and unintended interaction effects. But they say systems can be built for optimization and peak efficiency, or they can be built for evolvability, constant
Yes.
improvement in the light of new opportunities, problems of information, but not both. Because what Heather said before we got on the call, maybe Heather, you can talk about the example you mentioned about polar bears versus camels. But in terms of one being efficient and one being more
Resilient.
resilient.
Yeah.
So that is a big shift. So a lot of the execs in the C-suite, particularly for larger companies, they tend to be looking in the 3 to 5 year long-term planning horizon. Which realistically now, if big tech decides to invest in your industry and compete with you, you may not even be around in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So what you need
Exactly.
to be doing is take a page out of the Lean Startup book and start doing rapid iteration, build, test, learn, and always have your ear to the ground, horizon scanning. You need to be much more aware. You need to, we need to be looking up and out a lot more than we have been doing. I'll talk about that in a moment. But so I just think, but the shift from just in time to just in case, philosophically, is a big one for companies in the modern age. I'll pause there.
Yeah. Heather, Carl brought up the example you spoke about, which I think is I found so profound, especially in with this topic. You spoke about the polar bear versus camel. Can you just kind of expand
Yeah.
for our audience, what that was?
If you think of nature as a complex system, which it always is, um, nature evolves differently in a stable environment from a volatile environment. So until we got involved with the Arctic and global warming, the Arctic was a very stable environment, and the polar bear is massively efficient at living in what is effectively a stable environment. However, camels, in spite of we think of deserts as hot places, but actually they have a big volatility of temperature, and they quite often have quite a big volatility of humidity as well, from zero to
Hmm.
huge. The camel is actually brilliantly adapted to live in that volatile environment. And one of the problems for leaders in business is this assumption, because we have been living in what historically, if you compare against other ages, has been a massively stable period of time post the
Yes.
Second World War.
Yes.
We have become used to making
Yes.
efficient decisions because we assume that the world is stable, and the world is no longer
Yes.
stable. And my problem for leaders, I think, is that not only have they got that axis of complexity, they also, because of social media, because of things like COVID, they can no longer assume that their organization stops at its boundary. They have to be constantly looking externally. You look at the problems that people like Google and that have had, where their own employees have been presenting a view of their organization publicly. So you've got that externality of leadership and the role that leaders play in handling that. That's another lens of complexity. You've got the whole inequality and inclusion aspects. There are multiple axes on which leaders can
Yeah.
no longer take a single linear view. They have to take, as Carl says, that integrated complex,
Yeah.
systemic view of what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right, because for a number of years, and I think this is where a lot of the books that are now used in business school, we now have to burn them,
Yep.
because a lot of the theories that these academics came up with over this period of stability from the end of World War II till now can no longer work, especially when it comes onto the whole notion of leadership. Just coming back to your point where you made earlier, that the whole notion of leaders no longer, back in those days, or in that stable time, it was more around how do I leadership was equal to managing people or managing an organization to deliver shareholder value, right? Now we've shifted from the whole mantra of shareholder to stakeholder value, and leaders are struggling in terms of the whole notion of ESG, responsible business, investor demand in certain stuff, customers demanding, supply chain demanding, their people demanding stuff. So, with all of that, and we're going to come to the whole notion of discussing some trends. But before we jump into that, what do you think then that leaders in this new kind of realm and this new kind of environment, should business leaders take into consideration to improve their leadership, within this kind of environment? What's that new kind of redefining, and although we don't like the words definition, but reinvigorating what leadership really should mean in this current environment?
I can comment on that one.
Yeah, sure.
So I have the word in my notes here, scribbled down, adaptability. So we have,
Mm,
so okay, if I come back to I gave a headline on leadership intentionally to keep it simple, because as we unpack it, right, it's like an onion or the Russian dolls. So one of the things that leaders are tasked with is setting direction, and to do that, that setting direction strategy, right? And if
yeah,
strategy is the if one simple definition is that strategy is the fit between an organization and its environment. Well, the environment writ large, I'm not just talking about green environment, I'm talking about the landscape, is changing so dramatically and so rapidly. It's very hard to get a read on it. So one of the things is in leaders need to do more horizon scanning. I'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of adaptability, in my experience, it helps. It's essential to be open-minded to new ideas and new ways of thinking, be having new humility to do that, and to be a good listener. And then I would say, from my experience, to have access to individuals with cross sector, cross geography, cross functional experience who can help you see around corners. Some of the things. There's a lot more to it than that. But and the other point I would mention there is it's very important in my experience. A lot of innovation comes at the boundaries of where different networks or groups interact. So for example, me, I'm a member of different networking groups. One is called the Chairman's Network. It's board level directors. It's the typical people like you, people you want to be like, and people who want to be like you, that sort of thing. And then there's that. And then I'm on the Harvard Business Angel Screening Committee, and I plug into lots of other sorts of groups. Chapter Zero, the directors group for Net Zero, things like that, so that you actually get a feel for what's out there. Otherwise, the market can move ahead of you, and you just won't be aware of it. So there's that. In terms of you need to have access. And the final comment I'll make is we need to have much more sensitive sensors out there in terms of information. So, for example, during the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, Goldman Sachs used to close their books every day and mark to market the value of their assets and their holdings every day. Other banks were doing it weekly or monthly. So what that meant was Goldman Sachs could see the inflection point before the other players, because
right.
their metrics were more sensitive.
Yeah, yeah,
Now we need better tools and better kind of leading indicators that can tell us what's happening out there.
right.
I'll pause there, and they need to be much more sensitive than they were before.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, others can come in and eat our lunch, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and you can see, I did a quick scan of the companies on the Fortune 500, and I'm realizing that the lifespan of these companies are reducing drastically. First, a company could be on it for 50 years, then it's gone down to 20 years. Now it's like almost between 8 and 10 years before a company completely disappears. So Heather, do you think that leaders we need to have a complete retraining of what leaders, what leadership means to leaders, with all that has been said, and and what has happened.
Possibly. Uh, the lens through which I look at it as is, um, I do quite a lot of work on complexity, and there's a model called the Cynefin model, which has 5 domains, but the two interesting domains from leadership point of view are really complicated and complex. Complicated is kind of the linear, it might be multivariate, but it is linear, and that's very much the history, the environment in which leaders have grown up. So they've been promoted, they have expertise, they have seniority, they have respect based on
Hmm.
that ability to maneuver in a complicated world. They're experts at what they
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
Complexity, as we've talked about, has all of these dependencies, multivariates, it's all interconnected. Nothing is predictable, and it is a completely different tool set that you need. But
Hmm.
but the tool set can be learnt. So that's where I think your retraining comes in. But underneath all of that, for me, the real skill that I think leaders need, and I'm not sure how you develop this, I'm not sure it's as simple as training. The real skill for me is I know I have a complicated tool set. I need to do 2 things. I need to switch my mindset to say that the default position in which I am a leader is not within a complicated system, it's within a complex situation. So my default is now complex, and I need the sensitivity to understand where do I apply my complex tool set and where is my complicated tool set still relevant? Because it is still relevant. Carl mentioned several instances where you still need it, crisis mode and all the rest of it. But helping leaders to be really clear about the 2 modes, understand what the tool set is for both, and above all else, being able to distinguish when you are working in one and when you are working in another. And I've seen almost nothing about helping people through that distinction. And at the moment, I think we have a lot of leaders who have one side of the balance sheet, if you like, but don't have the other.
Yes, so I gave another talk on is your business strategy still fit for purpose when COVID hit, and now we've got war in Europe. There's just over the waves are just overlapping. We've got climate change. We've got so many potential risks out there. So there's a nice three-part, three-dimensional, a framework with 3 dimensions that talks about the strategic environment, the landscape that a company is participating in, or that a leader of a leader of a company is involved with. So, the 3 main dimensions when you look at strategy, there's unpredictability. How unpredictable is it? Is it uh, low unpredictability or high unpredictability? And then you've got malleability. You as a company, to what degree can we shape that environment? So those are the 2 main axes along which the environment can differ. And then you've got a third axis, which COVID highlighted, which is harshness. Right? When most of the world shut down, many revenue streams completely dried up. So that's an incredibly harsh environment. That's like in the desert when the camel has to be able to. The camel has 1 or 2 humps. He or she's built for that. Most
Yeah.
other animals, if you take a polar bear, you put them in the desert, they're going to have trouble. Then if there's no water, it's even worse. So many people found themselves as polar bears in a camel environment, and they weren't ready for it.
Mm.
So there's research that shows this in simulation. A Boston Consulting Group did a bit of work on this, where and if you were to lay that out, you've got the famous NBA 2x2 grid, where if you've got a highly unpredictable environment that you can't shape as a company, it calls for an adaptive strategy, where the imperative there is to be fast, right?
Yeah.
And then basically there are 4 quadrants there just to fill it out, right? So you have to be adaptive if it's high unpredictability, low malleability. Then if it's not that unpredictable, and you can't really shape it, then it's a classic strategy, which is be first, be big sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then if you can shape it, but the environment, if you can shape it and you can kind of predict it, then you can do the visionary approach. Maybe Steve Jobs at Apple, he kind of took a call there and went for it, right?
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
if you can shape it and it's unpredictable, then you can be a leader in that. So your company can be a leader in that space,
Yeah.
which Amazon is doing, right? Orchestrating lots of things. So here's the thing: as a leader, like I said, strategy is a fit between an organization and its environment. The environment is changing very rapidly. So lots of places for errors to be introduced. If you're in the boardroom and you're trying to assess what the environment is, you got to make sure you get that assessment right. And then you got to figure out what is our strategic response to that. And then are we executing the intended strategy that we set out, or is organizational friction and all the things that you both alluded to earlier getting in the way of us executing on it? So I'll pause
Yeah.
there. But that, long story short, means the current environment for many companies who can't shape it too much and they're dealing with unpredictability is an adaptive strategy.
I think what's coming out so far for me is that there definitely needs to be, Heather mentioned the toolkit, but I would probably say it's a toolbox with many different kits in it for this new realm of leadership. Because we mentioned the whole notion of adaptability. What does that mean? Agility, malleability, resilience, efficiency, strategy. How do we build a strategy where all of that is concerned? And then, Heather, something that I know that you've done lots of work on, etc., is the whole notion of horizon scanning. Like, how as a leader do we take all of this and make sure that we're building a strategy that is fit for purpose 10, 20 years down the line, but still has the agility and the flexibility and the resilience built in? Like, it seems like we need to kind of build a complete master's program around this topic right now.
Yes. When I started doing futures work, which was about 12 years ago now, it took me a little while to realize that the skill sets you need are actually different. So this isn't just about how do you change some of the conventional toolkits, it's actually about developing some different skills. So, Carl, you talked about the need for more signals from outside, and that's absolutely right. But if you try and put those signals into a nice linear process, it doesn't really work. And what I spend a lot of
Sure.
my time looking for is looking for patterns. So people say to
Mm,
me, you must do a hell of a lot of research. And I said, well, no, I don't. I spend about 10-15% of my time reading stuff all the time. But what I'm doing with that is I'm looking at the headlines and I'm looking at the landscape that's in my head for the future. And I'm saying, does that change my landscape? In other words, is the pattern changing on my landscape? Now, that's not how leaders in business tend to work. That's very much at this point in time, I'll do a pile of research and I'll make my decisions based on that. And then I'll revisit in 6 months, 3 months, 3 years, whatever is my time frame I've decided. And I really think that there's some really fundamental questions that leaders will need to ask themselves. So, one of the first questions is, how many versions of the future do I need? Because
mm-hmm.
there ain't one future. And to some extent,
Yes.
you can influence it, and to a great extent, lots of other factors will do it. So, you really need to have a number of possible futures, in my view, and then you need to understand how robust your business model, your operating model, your strategy is against those different possible futures. That's point one. Point two, you can't set out a detailed strategy for all of those. What you have to have, to my mind, is a North Star, a direction of travel, which needs to be authentic, by the way, coming back to purpose, with the purpose that you've set out for your business, but also coherent where your business has come from. Otherwise, it's not authentic. You need a North Star, and then it's about how do you have a short term strategy that keeps you pushing in your current environment on track towards that North Star, leaving you the
Mm,
agility to move if the external environment changes, but without changing your North Star. And that's a very, very different
okay.
way of
Sure.
thinking from the strategic, let's have a plan, let's have it all laid out, let's be able to explain to our investors exactly what we're going to look like in a year or two's time.
Yeah. I like that. And we do that as well. In our business, we have these, we call them OKRs. And although we set the OKR for a 2-year horizon, we kind of break it down to, okay, what are the OKRs for this 12 month period? But then we also go back and break it down per quarter. And at the end of every quarter, we revisit the entire OKR plan to see, okay, do we need to change? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to remove some stuff and add some stuff in? And this is not just me as the CEO and founder of the business doing that. Every single member of staff, right? The senior leadership team, the person in IT, every single person has to go through that, what we call a self-evaluation, and look at what were the OKRs for me over the past quarter, pinning to the OKRs, the strategic OKRs, and then also look at what the next quarter would look like, etc. So Karl, how often should leaders be, re-examining their strategy, taking into consideration this new new ecosystem of what leadership should look like?
Sure. So where I want to take the conversation, I'll address those points, is picking up on what Heather said. And Heather, you mentioned investors. So I have a strong background in ESG. My whole career has been an impact, right? So one of the things, back to scenarios and scenario planning, you're absolutely right in that regard. There are lots of potential futures. So what any company, anyone from any company who's listening, what's really helpful is that the big central banks have put together what they see as their view of the potential scenarios going forward. It's from a climate change perspective in terms of how orderly the transition to a low carbon economy will be. And basically, there are different dimensions there, but it has to do with how quickly certain governments act and give a clear line of sight versus how organically it emerges and which parts of the world are on top of it and not, and which ones have more trouble or not. So basically, but those scenarios have already been delineated by the central banks. And there's something called the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
Mark Carney, I've got Mark Carney's book here, by the way. I'd recommend it to people. It's called Values, right? Former Bank of England governor and Bank of Canada governor. But Mark Carney was chairing that initiative, and they basically reached out to a lot of the largest companies in the world that do public reporting, and they said, okay, now the investors and shareholders want to know, the big pension funds and other institutional investors want to know the amount of risk and opportunity, but the amount of risk these companies are exposed to. They now need to do more combined reporting, rather they need to do a double materiality or dual materiality, the financial materiality and the ESG or environmentally, the climate related materiality. That's forcing companies to take a more strategic, a more integrated systems level view on their business and the internality, externalities, all of that. So there are some base case scenarios out there you can look into. Now that's just from a climate perspective, but that's going to affect, and sorry, the other point is that TCFD, those regulations are coming into effect this year for publicly traded companies in the UK.
Yes.
They're
Yeah.
becoming law.
Yeah.
And they will be, and the SEC is looking into it. So it's basically the direction of travel is clear. So from that perspective, there is a framework which lays out some of the main areas that companies need to become conversant in this space, because arguably there are many overlapping risks, as Heather talked about, and I imagine you specialize in this, Heather. However, climate change is one of the big overarching ones, and basically what's happening is the agreements, the country level commitments that were made in the Paris 2015 Accord are now being translated. There are legal precedents with the Shell case and others where those
Yes.
country level targets are now being translated at company level. So if a company
Right.
says we're on target for net zero, but their KPIs and goals, their targets are not on that path for it, they can then
Yeah.
be pulled up and say, actually, you're not mapping toward meeting the country level goals that your country
Yes.
agreed to. So that gives a big picture frame. So when you're looking at the possible futures, those really helpful base cases. So I'll pause there. In terms of how often you need to revisit it, that's a longer discussion, but hopefully that's helpful in terms of scene setting, because from my perspective, Heather, absolutely right. If garbage in, garbage out, right? If you take the same old business and operating model and you put these new data inputs into it, as you said, if you're taking non-linear inputs into a linear system, they're going to be shaved down and not be as useful. You and I both have fairly sophisticated mental models, so when those inputs come in, we do the pattern recognition, as you say, right? So, but the average, I would liken it to this almost, really. So, I grew up in a big corporate. I worked at Johnson & Johnson, a wonderful company, and then I moved to mid-sized and smaller companies. Then I formed my own business. And wow, Stephen Covey famously said, and he's a leadership advisor, right? He was a professor and everything. He said the hardest shift for him was when he moved from being an advisor advising other companies to then having to run his own business and
Yes.
dealing with eating his own cooking, so to speak.
Yeah.
So
I can
I
relate.
had to go from being like when you were, I mean this affectionately, I was an employee for a long time. if you're working in a big company, you're almost like it's like the difference between a domesticated dog and a
Yeah.
wolf. One
Yes.
is used to
Absolutely.
hunting and reading the signals, and has not become accustomed to the food bowl being there every morning when they wake up, or the
Yes. Yes.
paycheck coming every couple
Yeah.
of weeks, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
each of us, in terms of that build, test, learn, and we need to realize, we need to kind of, like, also, if you have pets, birds as pets, they can't fly as far as they used to in the wild. They
Yeah.
just lose
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
capability. So
Yeah.
we each have gotten a bit, I would say, lazy, because we haven't had to do it. But now, if we don't do it, the business won't exist. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, no, definitely. But I'm not going to let you get away with not kind of giving some guidance in terms of how often do you think business leaders need to start, revisiting, is we do it once a quarter. Do you think that's adequate enough or is that too much?
So I would agree with Heather. So you mentioned earlier, Romeo, about the time horizon for planning. I agree with what Heather said about purpose and the mission of the organization. It doesn't change that often.
Right.
That is in the DNA of the organization. And then the strategy is oftentimes the tactics, or how your organization fits within its environment to achieve that
Yeah.
end. So the
Yeah.
strategy, I would agree with you. So in my own company, we'll do an annual planning exercise and then rolling 3 month and then monthly sorts of plans. And when the market starts to become more volatile, we'll do the
Hmm.
Goldman Sachs thing where we're tying out, daily, weekly, sometimes, to see
Yeah.
when there's some major trend, like with the Ukraine thing, because I'm a board advisor for 3 artificial intelligence companies that had 30
Hmm.
developers in Ukraine and Siberia. So we were watching. You better believe we were watching that like a hawk. I mean,
Yeah.
moment to moment, right, to
Yeah.
try to keep
Yeah.
everyone safe and everything else. So yeah, so it becomes a bit of, if you have, I would say, finger in the wind, but the annual planning, okay, great, but then really it's the rolling 3 month and then the monthly, and but it becomes management by exception there. But you
Yes.
can,
Yeah.
it's not a case of set it and forget it at all
Right.
anymore.
Okay. Yeah. It depends on the environment. As you said, the Ukraine, crisis came up, then you now have to jump on do it daily,
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and I did want to just, to give Heather more fodder, and I'll pause in a moment. But I mentioned the climate change strand. There, if I come up, I've got Ray Dalio's book here as well, right? Who runs the largest hedge fund in the world? He talks about these converging, what I would say, kind of mega trends, and there are three big ones: the mega debt and market cycle. So that the developed world is in this mega debt cycle. Okay, so they're basically indebted up to our eyeballs, right? And we've got all these pension requirements coming with the aging population. There's lots of other pressure points coming, okay, for countries that are carrying this level of debt. That's firstly,
Yeah.
and then that affects currencies and reserve currencies and all kinds of things. Secondly, is there are now larger gaps in wealth, values, and political views than we've seen in our lifetime. That's the second thing. And thirdly, geopolitically, because geopolitical risk is a huge another factor, which the war now in Europe shows us, which we hadn't had our eye on enough. Thirdly, there's now another rise, a burgeoning superpower to challenge the existing power of the United States, and that's playing out on a grand scale, in terms of geopolitically, militarily, economically, and all of that. So we need to factor that in as leaders as well, looking at things like supply chain disruptions, looking at, it's just the other point I was going to mention in terms of economically, where we've got inflation at 40-year highs in Europe and the US. We've got now quantitative tightening, at least in the US, where instead of easing, they're now tightening that back, so there's going to be a bit less liquidity there. Then I've got a bunch of notes here, but there's other, there's commodity spikes. I mean, nickel, the price of nickel went hyperbolic. They had to stop trading with the war in Ukraine. And Ukraine and parts of Russia is the breadbasket of Europe and other places, and provides a lot of energy and power. So, for example, if the West decides to put energy sanctions, firmer energy sanctions on Russia, it's going to plunge Europe and other parts of the world into a recession basically immediately. So you've got
Yeah.
all that. So I'll pause there, but there's lots of these factors that go into your models and into your thinking day to day. Well, how do we keep our service continuity with our supply chain? How do we be resilient? Lots of things to consider. I'll pause there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a perfect segue into the next. The other question that I had was about what are some of those leadership trends that leaders need to be kind of taking into consideration for the rest of this year. I know we've just finished Q1, and this could be a good way where people who are leaders who are listening right now could then kind of say, okay. How do I assess the rest of 2022 and beyond? So, Heather, what are some of those things that you have seen or foreseeing that leaders need to really look out for in terms of trends, whether or not they're mega or just trends that they really need to hone into?
I think the first is it's not so much a trend, it's a consequence of trends, which is I think leaders need to ask themselves more frequently and with more honesty just how radically does my business need to change? I think it's
Mm,
all too easy, particularly in crisis mode, to think about iterative shifts. And I think some of what we're talking about here, whether it's a mindset change, whether it's about becoming externally focused rather than internally, whether it's about are we in a growth or a post growth world, I think there are some really deep. So there's something about start to think about existential questions rather than just iteration. It's very comfortable because they're not easy, the iterative questions. So I think there's that.
yeah.
The second thing is what's going on at the moment in terms of what the so called great resignation, along with inclusivity. We've got a lot of issues around talent. And I think what COVID has done has brought to the fore for a particular group, a large group, the opportunity to rethink how they live their lives. I don't think this is just a I want to work from home. I think for many people it's a I tasted some form of freedom and I have
Mm-hmm.
realized and recognized there are now a lot more ways out there to earn money, to get income, and I don't necessarily always need that full-time job with that big organization that requires me to commute 2 days a week, whatever it is. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the whole question of talent and whether this is a question of just reshaping the offer, whether it's money, flexibility, or anything else, to get the people we want or to hold on to the people we want, or whether this is something deeper and more fundamental. And I believe it's something deeper and more fundamental. And that links to the whole longevity question and everything else. Um, the third thing I would argue is that um, fundamentally, the notion of a leader having the answers. And we've touched on this at various points in this conversation. But the notion of a leader having the skill sets in a world that requires increasing collaboration, increasing interconnectivity, increasing agility. This is, I think, for leaders, this is much more about how do I get the relevant network around me? How do I get the relevant ecosystem
Mm-hmm.
around me? And how do I learn to work well with those people, not only to bring out their potential, but to reach the decisions we need quickly, effectively? And some of those decisions will be to backtrack on things. Nobody's going to get this right. So there's an
Yes.
element of psychological
Yes.
safety here that says, how do I create comfort within this ecosystem that none of us have the answer, but between us, we can make progress? So those would be my three
Yeah.
things, really.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. I mean, we've done our research is showing, and we have a white paper. We'll provide a link for it in the comments below. But we'll also provide the links to the books and some of those methodologies that both of you speak about as well, so that people can refer to it. But these are um, these three trends that you mentioned, Heather. It's something that we've seen surfaced in this research that we're doing, the whole notion of principle based decision making, right? That honest assessment of where we really as a business and what are the decisions that we need to make that's benefiting to our stakeholders, in the business. We've seen that. And the whole notion of well-being. You talk about the great resignation, etc. The whole notion of well-being, and how do you manage the whole notion of inclusion around that. And for us as a business, we have a really radical approach. We call it rave, right? And it just means remote, agile, virtual, and empowered. And remote means our team, we don't care if you're on Mount Kilimanjaro or on the beach in the Bahamas. What is more important is that you deliver what you perform and you deliver. The other thing with us is that we've gotten rid of 9 to 5. So the agility is you work at the time that best suits you, right? So if that's 3 a.m. in the morning, or late at night, you do the best work then. And virtual is about the fact that we provide the systems and the technologies, so that people can deliver. So we use different platforms, to manage project, manage tasks. We provide virtual phone system where people can have an app on their phone that they can still call clients and speak to them if they need to. We have things like, the whole Microsoft 365 and other stuff. And the whole notion of empowerment is two ways. One is we empower the staff by saying, you need to just set your timelines, set your deadlines, and deliver them in terms of, making sure you're integrous around that. But empowerment is also saying to them, how can we support you in order for you to still perform and deliver within this culture that we're trying to create. So whether or not that's training or mentoring or providing external support. So you're right. And then also the whole notion that we see surfacing as well is, because we are never going back to the way how it used to be, where everyone is in the office, right? And there's this new hybrid way of working, even though companies are trying to get people to come back in the office, is how can leaders become more vulnerable, right? In terms of their leadership style, the vulnerability, and in order to get true collaboration, vulnerability has to be at the heart of it, right? And leaders have to recognize that the whole notion of vulnerability is not a weakness. Vulnerability is about, your strength, as Brian Brown says, you have to be on the arena and you have to show up and you have to let people know that, right now I am not feeling, the mood. One of the things we do here is we do a check-in at every meeting, where people have the ability of saying, how am I feeling right now in this moment? Do I even feel the need to be in the meeting and in the space right now, right? So you're right. We're seeing a lot of these coming out of the research that we're doing, and leaders need to be aware of that. Karl, jumping over to you, you spoke about some of these, mega trends in terms of, the mega debt, the geopolitical landscape, etc. What are some of the other trends that are, so those could be, yeah, those are trends, and they tend to be a little bit external to a business, which leaders need to be aware of. What are some of the others you're seeing, but also are you spotting any that, as it relates to the leadership within the ecosystem of the business, that leaders need to be aware of?
Right. So just want to 2 points. One is my working definition of intimacy, or let's say authentic connection, is shared vulnerability.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's
definitely.
one thing. Second, the other point I would mention is, so for someone like me, for me, Heather, yourself, when I point out the fact that when I mention those economic indicators, right? I mean, the markets are responding, the markets are moving. So I'm in private equity, right? So uh, let me join the dots for the listeners. This comes from the manager of a multi-billion-dollar fund. He said two things. He said, there's been no shortage of capital out there in terms of multi-billion-dollar funds that are looking to invest. There's just a shortage of leadership to deploy it into. Okay, and what sort of leadership is it? He said, well, it used to be the case with been a sea change. It used to be the case that in order to be sustainable, you first had to be profitable. Now, in order to be profitable in the midterm, at least you need to be sustainable.
Yes, yes.
Right. So that is back to the mindset we talked earlier about. That's taking a stakeholder and stewardship view
Yes.
of your business. And also, I would say, big picture and North Star is your business making money, profiting from, you're either doing one of two things. You're either making money as a business directly or indirectly by contributing to problems with people and planet and prosperity, or you're making money by helping to resolve those problems and restore environment, people, and prosperity. So
Yes.
that's the one exam question for any business. If you look at
Yeah.
the implications and the impacts of your business, positive and negative, what is the net effect of your business existing? So what does that mean in practice? What I'm seeing is it's easier for companies that are leading in this space, that are clear on their purpose and are having restorative or doing well and trying to do well by doing good. It's easier for them to raise money. The cost of capital is lower. So if you're a CFO, Mark Carney talks in his book about sustainable finance. So
Mm-hmm.
what they did at the Bank of England, for example, they looked at their portfolio and said, "Ooh, let's assess the climate impact of our holdings now in the Bank of England." And they said, "Ooh, the net effect of the projects we're currently funding would be those projects would contribute to a 3.5-degree increase in the climate temperature."
Yeah.
Well, we can't stand for that. We better rebalance and move our money and our priorities toward a portfolio that's at least maximum 2% or 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees net
Yeah.
climate impact. So that's how it flows through to balance sheets and funding
Yeah.
decisions. Okay,
Yeah.
that's why all
Yeah.
this TCFD and all this stuff matters, because banks are charging. They may not lend at all to companies that are not on board with this, or it's going to charge them more. In one hand, the other point I would mention. We need to have our eye on the geopolitical situation, because it affects the scenarios that we're planning to, that we're working towards. So if we put our strategic horizon scanning and scenario plans together, and one of our plans did not cover what happens if there's a war in Europe, well, how do we react to that? So if we're in the commodities business, or if we're in the shipping industry, right, or China just locked down again now because of Omicron virus, that's leading to a renewed supply chain disruption like we had during the pandemic. How shipping costs like tripled during the pandemic, for example. So that's the so what about what it means. That's why we need to pay attention to all that. And the final thing I would say for us as leaders and human beings, right? All the change that's out there, the volatility, the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous that we live in. What doesn't change, what is stable, is the human element, the human perspective. All those factors are experienced through the human experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And therefore, and we all need to lead ourselves first. So from a leadership perspective, we need to check in with ourselves, get and stay centered, right? And then I got one or two points I want to mention, and I'll pause. But where as leaders, we have three kind of ways we can operate in the brain, right? There's the ancient lizard reptile brain, which is fight, flight, or freeze. It's a survival brain. Then you've got the kind of next level, which is the monkey brain. They call the monkey brain, which loves to be stimulated, watches the news, and loves to kind of use tools and do things that we know. And then there's the visionary or entrepreneur, what I would call the visionary brain,
Yeah.
which is higher order thinking, planning, judgments, intuition, all that. Which
Yeah.
you don't now if you're stuck in the news cycle with the media, which is polarizing us more and more, if you're stuck in the fear mode or in the overstimulation dopamine hit mode of news feeds or YouTube or whatever it is that whatever your fix is, you don't get into the visionary mode. You don't actually get to pause, breathe, lift your head up and look further out to take a bigger view on who we are and where we're trying to go as a business and as people. So I'll pause
Yeah.
there. I would just encourage all, and the trick is we can't be in both monkey brain and visionary brain at the same time. So
Yes.
in every moment we're practicing something. What are you practicing? I'll pause there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most definitely. I mean, wow, guys, the three of us know that this discussion could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, and I'm definitely gonna bring you guys back in a number of shape or form so that we can continue this, because what I'm finding, or what we're finding here at Lumerous, the more we work with boards and members in the C-suite, is that they're struggling around a lot of these things, right? They have been trained in a certain way, especially through business schools, to think of leadership in a certain way, and they have been operating in that kind of frame, and now all these things are being thrown at them, and they're really struggling in terms of, how do I compute this, how do I live up to the expectation of my people in my organization, the society in general. How do I ensure that as a business we're compliant with these new regulations that are coming down the pipeline? And also, how do I ensure that I ensure that you know I'm vulnerable, I'm collaborative, I am being an inclusive leader, and champion the whole notion of diversity and inclusion, both internally and externally. There are all of these added pressure that comes into being, and then doing all of that and making sure that your investors are happy, because you have to deliver a return on their investments, right? So I'm pretty sure that there is going to be a lot more around this that we can talk about. But just before I kind of sum up, Heather, is there anything else that you'd like to throw in to kind of before we wrap this up, and then I'll jump over to you, Karl.
When I started doing future stuff 10, 12 years ago, we spoke to a management professor, And he said that by 2020, the top criteria needed by any leaders would be tolerance of ambiguity. And I think that is
Mm.
now so apparent. And yet, I don't know of any organization that trains for tolerance of ambiguity, measures it. I'm not even sure you would know how to measure it. Certainly, I don't know of any organization that foster it. So here we are with something that we've known for a long while is a characteristic that's needed. And part of the problem that you've just set out, I would argue, Romeo, is that in dealing with all of those things, all of which are perfectly valid concerns, people are still looking for certainty and guarantees that it will all be okay.
Yeah, yeah. I really, really like that, Heather. I'm gonna steal that actually. Tolerance of ambiguity. I think that is really in all of this noise that's happening. It's the ambiguity that that leaders need to define and to plan towards and tolerate when it does happen. Yeah, perfect. Karl.
I have two final points very briefly. So, as we're going through this process, and Heather talked earlier about how much organizations may need to change or transform, I always say change can be incremental or evolutionary. Transformation is often revolutionary. And the so what about that is for individuals in an organization is that the ego cannot tell the difference between transformation and annihilation. So
Mm.
it can feel like an existential crisis. So therefore, individuals. So as a leader, be supportive. And as a closing comment, I've got three main things I try to embody in my better moments. Three main qualities, okay, virtues: courage, inspiration, and love, which I think leaders nowadays need to embody those three. But there's just a quick quote here on courage from a book. It's called The Book of Virtues, Inner Beauty, and they say, "Courage Courage doesn't come unbidden merely in a moment of danger. It is the fruit of consistent effort to play life by the rules. Its expression is the tip of something enormous, formed over years. A rock below the surface which, just visible, becomes an island for others to rest on. You know when there is courage, you know when courage is there in someone. You can sense it and it makes you trust them."
Mm-hmm.
So, in this raging storm, and as we as leaders navigate maybe to the eye of the storm for a bit of peace in an uncertain world, if we can have courage to lead and take decisions and be informed, and the courage to be vulnerable and open up to others and receive inputs and collaborate, then we help engender the trust that's needed to make it through, right? The old African proverb:
Yes.
if you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go in a group.
Yes, yes, yes. I smile when I hear that, and it tickles my heart because our tagline at Lumerous is, redefining a new role for courageous businesses. And I think that it's only with courage that leaders and, we in this kind of environment will be able to kind of reshape their business and also deal with the tolerance of ambiguity that comes out of this kind of new environment. Man, we're definitely going to be speaking again on multiple occasions, guys. So, all I'd like to say is just kind of, thank you both for sharing the past hour with us, and also, the fact that this is the launch of our podcast here at Lumerous, the Leadership Melting Pot, and I could not ask for two better guests to be part of that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Your thoughts and contributions to the conversations, are welcome. Feel free to add your comments, down below. Feel free to, continue the conversation with us either via Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or via Medium at Lumerous PLC. And also, just follow and subscribe and share this with other people in your network as well. We'd really, really appreciate that. So, Karl, Heather, thank you guys so much, and have a great rest of the week and enjoy the bank holiday coming up.
Thank you, Romeo.
Thanks,
Thank
Romeo.
you.
It's a pleasure being here. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for joining us. You can also reach us and find out more about us via our website, lumerous.com.